All right, so in the same vein as the whole China owns a whole bunch of our debt and they can crush us in the blink of an eye if they call it in, oh, let's be scared of our impending economic doom series, where I say, relax, it's not something to be afraid of. There's a lot that people don't know about this if they are afraid. So that when international trade and exchange rates come up, there are people who have heard of this fear that a lot of people have that the world's reserve currency, which is US dollar, will be replaced. And that this could be highly problematic for the United States economy. It's a shock that can just completely destroy things. Prices for everything will go through the roof, and it can be very serious. So what are we talking about here? Well, the world's reserve currency. What does that mean? And why is it the US dollar? Well, every country keeps other countries' currencies in reserve. And when I say every country, I do mean at the government level, usually at the central bank. Each central bank and each treasury has a certain quantity of other countries' currency at the ready, because there are a lot of reasons that at the government level, exchanges are going to need to be made. And especially when it comes to the Federal Reserve, when exchanges are made, as often as not, it's banks making those exchanges. So it's usually the Federal Reserve, but this can also mean any individual person or company at any time that holds another country's currency because they expect they're going to have to use it soon. But we typically look at central banks because that's where you're usually going to find most of each country's stockpiles of a foreign country's currency, because banks will ask central banks to give them some real quick so that they can facilitate an international transaction. That's the smoothest, most fluid way to do it in many cases. In the early 20th century, the pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. It is now the US dollar. To be the world's reserve currency, it says right here that when you look at every country in the world, their central banks or whatever entity is stockpiling currencies for other countries to have at the ready when trades happen. If you add up all the currency held in reserve, that hence the word reserve, throughout the entire world, all the world's central banks, you add them all up, the one that ends up being held in higher quantities than all the rest is going to be the world's reserve currency. When you hear people talking about why we have to be super scared of this newest big thing that's going to destroy our economy, they talk about it as though some arbitrary decision was made by some small group of unaccountable Illuminati types of people who just on a whim decided to make it the US dollar. Biggest economy, let's make it the dollars. All in favor say aye. And everybody raises their hand, and that's the way it works. And the reason there's a fear here is because countries that are not necessarily favorable to the United States, certain OPEC countries and Russia and China, have publicly groused in the past about, it's kind of a British thing, grouse. They've complained, basically, about the US dollar being the reserve currency, and have at various meetings of central bankers around the world, and have talked about how they would like for the US dollar to not be the reserve currency anymore. There have been proposals for one world currency, one international currency that is basically like the euro for everybody, as the thing to take over as basically the only currency that anybody holds in reserve, maybe just to take the United States down a peg. And apparently people think that this was proposed at these meetings of all the different members of the New World Order, and it was voted down narrowly. We dodged the bullet, but what's going to happen when they all come together next year? That's not how it works. There are meetings of central bankers around the world because they have to work together on various things, and so they'll meet occasionally to figure out how to do things in the smoothest ways possible, and that sort of thing can be brought up. But it's not something that is voted on. It's something that happens literally because of this right here. Countries just, and I actually pointed out on the next slide here, a currency just basically naturally emerges when a country is kind of the major player in international trade. It's not because anybody is deliberately trying to favor the US dollar because they like the United States more than anybody else. What's going on is you don't want to have too much of a given currency. You have to buy it. You have to spend your money to get another country's currency. So you don't want to buy currency you're not going to use. But you also don't want to find yourself in a place where a transaction needs to happen, but you need to make people wait. That can be costly too. Your time is money. You can get into a lot of reasons why that's a problem. So you want to make sure you have all the currency you need at the ready for all the trade you're going to have with a given country, but you don't want too much. You don't want too little. You don't want too much. You want to try to get it just right. So you're going to have less of a currency that you don't see your country exchanging its own currency over for much. You're going to have some, but you're going to have less if it's just a little bit. And you're going to have a ton of whatever currency you find is most often sought after by people who are exchanging their currency for someone else's. And you're going to maintain it in reserve and be ready to use it for whenever somebody comes looking for a different currency. And just looking at trading patterns and anticipating how these things are going to happen in the future, each country just reacts. There may be some countries, I haven't looked into it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some countries that don't have more US dollars than other currencies, and that's just because they don't trade as much with the United States. It's when you add up everyone in the world in total, the US dollar is the thing that everybody holds on to on average more than any other currency, because that's the one, and that's why it was the British pound. The British government, the British economy used to be the most important economy for international trade for a long time, and in the early 20th century, the United States took over, and it became the US dollar. Nobody meant for it to happen. Nobody tried to make that happen. It wasn't done on purpose. It wasn't done because anybody decided they just liked the US more than Britain. It just kind of happened all by itself. So that's these meetings. No one can arbitrarily just say don't do it, and it's because for a country to not hold on to as many US dollars and instead have whatever other currency is arbitrarily decided as the new currency, they're acting against their own self-interest. They're putting themselves in a position where they're spending money on a currency they don't need, so they have less money, and they have a shortage of supply of currency that they do need, which is going to make it more expensive when they need to purchase that currency, or trades are just not going to happen. Every country has to go against their own self-interest to boot the dollar off as a world's reserve currency. It's going to be the world's reserve currency until, if and when, some other country emerges as the main player on the international stage, which may or may not happen in our lifetimes. It doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. So why might this be a problem? Well, what happens here is basically most things are denominated in terms of US dollars, because that's going to be oil is one of the big ones. It's sold to the United States. Well, it traditionally has been. That's happening less and less, but it's often been sold to the United States more than to any other one country. So it's going to be denominated in dollars first. There are fewer frictions involved in being able to buy oil for dollars, so oil ends up being cheaper. Energy costs are cheaper, and that's just better for our economy. But it happens with just about anything else in foreign trade. You are more likely to be able to get dollars to be accepted because other countries have those in reserve and they can have them at the ready than anything else. It's just like with China holding on to more U.S. treasuries. It facilitates trade. It's just another way of having something at the ready. Have more dollars, you can trade more easily. So it's it's advantageous for your country to be the reserve currency because it makes things cheaper on average because it's that much less waiting, that much less friction, fewer steps involved in obtaining the currency that you need. So it's an advantage, and it can be a pretty strong advantage that happens naturally, and it happens to the countries that maybe need fewer advantages, so it might be seen as a little unfair, but it's just the way international markets work. It's going to happen whether people like it or whether Russia likes it or not. It's going to happen. There's really not much that can be done unless and until they can convince everyone to accept one world currency for international trade. But again, for a lot of reasons, we won't necessarily get into that here, but it doesn't really work when you consider some of the reasons why the euro has had difficulties, because you have a lot of very different economies that are using one currency. It's like in the first video, we talked about different costs of living in different places in the United States using the same currency. There's enough commonality to where that's not a problem, but the more variation you have, the less well the currency operates. So domestic currencies still tend to be better for international trade. So like with so many other things that people are afraid of, this is not necessarily something to be afraid of. It is an advantage. It's not the word, I mean, the British economy was fine when the US economy overtook it. Yeah, things get more expensive, but people adjust and adapt over time. The initial shock could be hard if it happens suddenly, but again, this is something that doesn't happen subtly. It happens gradually over time, and prices adjust, and various components of supply and demand adjust accordingly as this sort of thing eases into a new reality. So this is yet another thing that a lot of people are afraid of, that the next big economic crisis will come from here. And again, the thing to be afraid of is the thing that you don't see coming, because historically, economies, when we've had major problems, they were things we didn't see coming, like this COVID-19 thing. So I guess it's not very reassuring to say that be afraid of something you can't really see or define right now. Maybe that's a little scarier, but because that's always going to be the reality, at the very least you can check one more thing off the box that might have had you worried. The US dollar is not going anywhere as a world's reserve currency. It can't be dislodged arbitrarily, and if it does ever happen, it's going to happen gradually enough to where we're not even going to necessarily notice, like most British citizens didn't necessarily notice when the pound became the world's number 2 and the US dollar took over. So one less thing to be afraid of, and that's good.